We do have our first session today. It is super sustainable, very attainable, a neighborhood to get excited about. This conversation will be led by Ben Willis from Union Studio Architects rather. And unfortunately, Donald was unable to join us. But if you do have any questions for Ben during the presentation, please put them in the chat. At the end of the presentation, I will ask you to unmute and ask your question.
Amy and Tuni, thank you both for having us here. Really excited to be here and talk about the Veridian neighborhood project. My name is Ben Willis. I'm an architect with Union Studio. I'm sending Don's deepest apologies that he can't be with us this morning. He had a family emergency and does send his sincere regrets, but so you're stuck with me for the next 40 minutes. But this is an exciting topic and a really exciting project, so hopefully I'll do it justice, and we'll dive right in. A little bit about Union Studio, just so you know who we are. We're a mission-driven architecture and community design firm that uses the power of design to enrich lives and strengthen communities. We were founded in 2001. We're based in Providence, Rhode Island, although we have a fledgling satellite office in Philadelphia now too. And we've got projects all over the country. Much of our work is residential, but that spans the range from affordable housing, to student housing, to cottage neighborhoods, all the way up to sort of larger community and neighborhood planning initiatives. And we also work on larger mixed use buildings, including historic retrofits, hotels. You might recognize the Hammett's Hotel in Newport there that we just completed, and a lot of work with nonprofits, which is fantastic. I think the thread that really weaves through our work is community. How do the buildings and spaces and the design process that we follow enable communities to thrive? And today we're going to focus on a community that we're designing in Michigan. And you may be wondering why Michigan. So this is talk about this 12-acre, 150-home mixed-income neighborhood in Ann Arbor that harvests its own energy, collects and treats all of its stormwater, and even produces some of its own food on site. And my hope is that this presentation will be two things. The first is inspiration. Even though the numbers and the data that are telling us that we're racing towards a more dire climate crisis every day, it should be motivation enough to do something. I think we also need something energizing, a way to sort of imagine the future that we want to create, so we can start creating that now with a little more optimism. And since we don't have much time, this is also a call to action for Rhode Island and the surrounding communities. I think, obviously one neighborhood in Michigan is not going to solve the climate crisis, but there's power in a demonstration project. And again, hoping that sharing some of how the rubber meets the road here, we can spark some coalitions of motivated citizens and developers and funders here in Rhode Island to sort of continue a sustainable trajectory of development and continue to challenge our existing paradigms. A quick agenda for today, we'll talk a little bit about the history, and I'll give you some orientation on Veridian County Farm. That's the name of the neighborhood that we're designing in Michigan. We'll talk a little bit about the design elements, give you some of the high-level project goals, and then we'll touch on how we can bring this to Rhode Island and what's down the road, and we should have some time for questions and conversation after. So the recipe for Veridian, for this super sustainable neighborhood, really starts with the forward-thinking development team. They were inspired to start as a development team because of the current ecological crises that we're facing, and wanted to prove that a different model of development is possible. So this is a team of 3 green building and construction experts based in Ann Arbor. One of the founders did the first net zero home in Michigan, and that was an 18th century farmhouse that he converted to be net zero, which is really cool. Sort of got hooked on that and decided, let's figure out how to scale up. But what's important about Thrive is that ecological restoration is really core to their mission and their bottom line. So then we add in a decommissioned and now demolished juvenile detention center, which is probably not where you thought we were going. But that demolished detention center sits on a 12-acre parcel of municipal-owned land that's adjacent to 130 acres of regional park and this burgeoning commercial district right on the edge of Ann Arbor. Here's just a map in case anyone's familiar with the city. Veridian, our project, is down here. So we're a little ways away from sort of the hub of activity around the University of Michigan, but we are right in the thick of, again, a lot of residential development. So the municipality decided in 2016 that they wanted to do something better with that land. So they released a request for proposals for developers to propose a higher and better use there. And then the county was going to review those proposals and select a winner really based on public benefit criteria. So Thrive realized this was an ideal opportunity to take their vision for a radical neighborhood and scale it up. So they assembled a team in mid-2016. We worked through some initial site layouts, won the RFP at the beginning of 2017, went through a sort of a year of negotiation with the county, and then really started to develop the master plan with a whole lot of meetings from mid-2018 through late 2019. We registered for the Living Community Challenge in early 2019, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then we had a lot more meetings, this time in public, in front of the planning boards and city councils, and received unanimous approval at the end of last year. And so we are now hoping to break ground for the site infrastructure this summer, with an estimated completion for the whole 150 unit neighborhood in about 2 years. So all of this to say that these projects are a marathon and very much a long-term investment. And so I think it's worth it in the end, but it certainly takes some time getting there. In addition to their bold vision, one of the other things that Thrive did right out of the gate to set up what we might call like an infrastructure for success is they started with a big team of mission-driven experts from all over the country. And they tasked us with this question: how can the physical design of this neighborhood support human and natural ecosystems? And this design process that we started was very non-linear in a way, insofar as we had to be thinking really big and really small all at the same time right out the gate. So the initial charrette that we had in Ann Arbor, sort of on the site, we were talking about, big questions: what kind of residents would be moving here? Where are we putting the buildings and the roads? We were also talking about, what kind of plant material do we need here? What kind of materials are we using? How much solar energy capacity do we have here? Where does the trash go? And so this whole process, again, involved thinking about a lot of different elements right out the gate. But a second part of the sort of infrastructure for success that Thrive put together was immediately reaching out to the community. So even before they won the RFP, they were out in the neighborhoods. They were talking to sort of people in and around Ann Arbor, movers and shakers, about what they wanted the future of Ann Arbor to look like. How would this neighborhood fit within that vision? How do they, as sort of a new development entity, build trust with the folks who are here and the folks who might want to be here? And really, how do they stay grounded in these values that they are claiming as a development company? And the result was, throughout the entitlement process, they built this really strong support network, from neighbors to business leaders to, again, the mayor and a few council members. And so again, that led to a really, although the entitlement process was long, it was very smooth insofar as the people involved were very excited about the outcome. So what exactly did we propose here? Here's a quick view of the site. Again, this is the 12-acre parcel of land. You can see all of these trees here. This is the County Farm Park. There's a rec center just to the plan north. And the residential neighborhood down south here. And the site is sort of beautiful rolling hills and some pretty cool landmark trees that we did our best to save quite a few of those. And again, you can see where the former youth detention center was, that's now a concrete slab. So what we ended up with was 50 units of affordable housing, 100 units of market rate housing, and all of these mixed in a bunch of different building types, which we'll continue to talk about and sort of show you some examples of in a minute. But the buildings and green spaces and public spaces were all layered on and woven together with the sidewalks and the roads and infrastructure to support them. But we were really prioritizing the pedestrian experience and prioritizing a comfortable measure of social interaction. So like, how do we encourage people to get to know their neighbors and to get outside just, the bounds of their house? We started designing this before the pandemic, but I think even more, this feels really like something we need to be going after. Like I said, the neighborhood is sort of like a Swiss watch and a Swiss Army knife. And so Swiss watch, insofar as like every piece needs to fit very precisely in just the right way, and sort of like a Swiss Army knife insofar as pieces need to be multitaskers. So not only are the buildings providing shelter, but they're also producing energy. The green spaces are providing gathering, but they're also treating stormwater. The pavement is carrying bikes, but it's also, how can we make it impervious so that the stormwater flows right through it? And this plan here is actually pretty close to what exists now and what we submitted in the RFP. So that's really carried through. And I just want to take a quick minute to look at it in comparison to the other proposals, because I think that this is a great way to see sort of what we might call conventional development models, sort of what the market is set up to deliver typically. These in large part really prioritize automobile convenience over pedestrian walkways. They use a lot of big buildings, and I don't think there's anything wrong with big buildings as a way to provide dense housing. But the spaces between these buildings, I think, leave a lot to be desired, again, particularly from a pedestrian perspective. And these larger buildings in this sort of sea of parking, I think they don't really relate to the neighborhood fabric in which this sits. These feel a little bit sort of out of scale, and I also don't think that they necessarily engage with the sort of social interaction goals that we had. And none of the other proposals really had any of the sustainability targets that Veridian was going after. But here, I think, is a sort of key reason why Veridian was able to work, insofar as when these proposals were submitted, the community made a conscious decision that they were willing to take some short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. So our proposal didn't actually produce as much housing as these other proposals. They had more units. And we weren't going to be able to pay as much for the land in order to make our pro forma work. But again, the community said, you know what, this high quality vision of a sustainable future is worth the sort of sacrifices that we're going to have to make in the short term for these long-term gains. So that's what they decided on. And here's what we hope the Google Earth 2024 will look like in that neighborhood. I want to just dive a little deeper into some of the project goals, and specifically those around sustainability, since that's what our conversation today is really focused on. So I'd say our first goal with this project was to meet the Living Community Challenge, and specifically to be a net zero energy community. Our second goal was food production and regional economy, and thinking about how we connect those things in with a sort of residential scale neighborhood, connectivity between the neighborhood and the larger region, diversity and affordability, both in terms of residents and in terms of the building types that are built in the neighborhood, and community and social spaces, because we know that those are really critical to a neighborhood. Regardless of how much solar power you have, you want it to be a place that people feel good about calling home. So to this first goal, the Living Community Challenge, I think this is the most robust sustainability program, certainly in the US, but maybe in the world. And it's a philosophy more than a checklist, and certification as a Living Community Challenge project is based on actual rather than sort of modeled or anticipated performance. The International Living Future Institute is an organization out of Seattle They were started in the early 2000s, and they started with the Living Building Challenge, but they really asked, what if buildings, instead of just doing less harm, could actually make ecosystems better? So, for example, the materials that we're using on these buildings, what if instead of just extracting less carbon and using less resource, could they actively support more equitable and transparent industries? And they looked at, the metaphor of a flower. A flower produces everything that it needs. It's its own energy, its own food, its own water, and it gives back oxygen. So what if we challenged ourselves to make a building that did this? And then they started to extend that metaphor beyond just buildings, so that now they have a living product challenge and this living community challenge, with projects being certified all over the world. Although I will say the community challenge is still fairly new, thinking about this sort of beyond the scale of a building. And so Veridian is actually on the cutting edge of living community challenge master plans in the US. I don't know that we're the first certified, but we're among the first for sure. And the way that this sets itself up, again, in terms of philosophy and criteria, is with a series of petals that the project aims to meet. And go through just a couple quickly here that this neighborhood is aiming for. The first of which is place. And this is thinking specifically about how we limit the sort of human impact on place, but it's also thinking about urban agriculture. There's a habitat exchange program. So for these 12 acres that we're developing, we have to put into a land trust somewhere else in Michigan, 12 acres of land that will be permanently kept for wildlife. Energy is obviously very important in a net zero, or in this case, a net positive energy development. So 105% of the community's needs, including all the energy for our water and waste conveyance, have to be harvested from on-site sources. The health and happiness petal talks about how we build resilient communities. And again, they're looking at sort of what happens to a community if it faces a natural disaster of any kind. Does it have the physical infrastructure to keep housing its residents, but also does it have the social infrastructure? So a lot of the kind of public and gathering space initiatives are really important. And it, is the neighborhood we're building healthy? Are we using healthy materials? Equity is also very important. How is the money that is being spent on this neighborhood investing in equitable companies, materials that have transparent supply chains? Is there universal access in the neighborhood to the nature and community services that are being provided? And then beauty and inspiration, which is really how do we use all of these sustainability elements to celebrate and uplift the human spirit. So as part of I think the most aggressive target in our series of petals there, net zero energy, how do we do that in Ann Arbor, Michigan? Well, certainly solar panels are a big part of that discussion. And I should say too that net zero just means that all the energy used over the course of a year is offset by the energy produced. This will be an all-electric neighborhood. We'll have no on-site fossil fuel burning appliances. So we've got to do everything electric. And part of this project, part of the Veridian project, is to say that solar can work at a big scale in cold climates. So we can't use winters as an excuse. But one of the really innovative opportunities with Veridian is that they're creating a microgrid in partnership with a local utility company. So a microgrid is kind of exactly what it sounds like, insofar as it's a smaller grid of electrical power storage and users, connects to the main grid, but can be, and most of the time sort of runs in conjunction with the main grid, but can be disconnected. And as I think we've seen already this year, our existing electrical grid, when it fails, can have really catastrophic consequences. And so finding ways to provide some resilience in our electrical delivery is really important. And then also microgrid allows for scale jumping or sort of sharing. So if your solar panels on your house are producing 120% of your your excess energy, you can be sharing that with your neighbors, and maybe the orientation of their house is such that they aren't producing as much energy. So it's a neat process. Also, a big part of solar generation is the almighty battery. So we'll have one solar battery at least per home here to continue delivering that energy. And we're also using geothermal heat pumps here. So these have been around since the 1940s. They are not as cutting edge as I think a lot of people think, but they work really well at taking the sort of consistent temperature of the ground and using that to help heat and cool homes throughout the year. We're also thinking about sustainability beyond just the individual building and the sort of technology involved in the building. And so our second goal here was food production in the regional economy. Almost 30% of our neighborhood site needs to be provided for food production. And this means, a little bit of sort of traditional farm and edible gardens, but it also means fruit trees. The landscaping that's maybe next to a terrace might have some edible components to it. So again, really thinking about how the green spaces between the building can serve more than just green. And there's also provisions in our public space in this neighborhood for a permanent farm stop. And this is based on a really cool regional farm stop model in Ann Arbor that provides a physical location, sort of grocery stores, if you will, but all of the meat and dairy and produce and finished goods are provided by local farmers at affordable prices. So all of that money stays in the regional economy, and it connects both the regional farmers and the regional consumers together in a way that's predictable and regular. Another way that we're connecting this neighborhood with the regional economy will be by using local artists to create public art in the neighborhood. And again, this is it's a very tight site. So we're thinking about clever ways to take functional things like signage and wayfinding and using local craftspeople to produce that. This is an example of an informational sign at a neighborhood called Serenby in Georgia. And in particular, one of the other petals of the Living Community Challenge is education. So showing people who live in a neighborhood or visitors to the neighborhood how these various sustainability features are working, and providing sort of an opportunity for communication and informal community building moments. And so again, if we can integrate that with these local art installations, so much the better. Our third goal is connectivity. In a way, this is maybe most important to sustainability insofar as if you can get places by foot or by bike, you don't have to bring your car out, which is great. But it's also one that designers have not a whole lot of agency in, except to try and sort of use as much of the site as you can. And this is another instance where the market, I think there's clearly a market drive for these walkable places, but they're hard to deliver for a number of reasons, and we'll get into some of that later. But you can see here, this is the yellow outline here is the footprint of Veridian, and it's got all of these sort of regional amenities around it. This is a lot more auto-oriented than maybe we'd like for a commercial district, but it's certainly better than nothing. And as part of this neighborhood, we're designing in electric bike and electric car shares, which is one way that we can encourage residents who live in the neighborhood to maybe give up one car. Maybe they only need one car now if they have reliable shared transportation. Our fourth goal is diversity and affordability. And when we talk about affordable housing, we talk about it in two ways. One of which is certainly sort of subsidized affordable housing, but the other is in figuring out how we design housing units of varying sizes such that you don't have to invest in a 4-bedroom, 4,000 square foot home to be part of a neighborhood. There's a large range of housing types, what we call the missing middle housing types, between a single family home and a multi-unit apartment building, townhouses and duplexes and triple deckers. And so figuring out the balance of these smaller units with the larger units allows a whole range of future residents to have different price points and the ability to move into the neighborhood and then to stay there as they move through different stages in their life. And I just will orient you with the site plan here again and talk a little bit about some of the different types of buildings that we have on the site. And again, really how they create the public space and this opportunity for choice of different units. So we do have a couple of multifamily apartment buildings here, some as small as 400 square foot micro units, or more traditional kind of one bedroom apartments. We have a series of townhouses that are connected single family homes. And then we have a few what we call the village homes, sort of more traditional separated larger homes for a sort of single family unit. But we also, making sure that this was actually a mixed income neighborhood was another of Thrive's goals right from the outset. And so they partnered with Avalon Housing, which is a local nonprofit housing developer in Ann Arbor. So they were with us from the beginning and were huge in terms of helping to figure out the profile of the kind of residents that would be part of this neighborhood that we might miss in a sort of traditional market survey. And they are also responsible for developing 50 of the affordable housing units on the site. I will say I think this is one place that we had a bit of a less than ideal circumstance. If you look at the site plan here, you'll see that most of the Avalon units are sort of up at the northern end of the site and not sort of right next to the market rate housing. And this, I think, illustrates a challenge here. This was really due to restrictions by funders and the municipality that forced our hand into having two very clearly delineated legal parcels. And we looked at ways to sort of sawtooth these together. And our original vision had been that these would be completely integrated, but because of these sort of funding and municipal regulations, this is where we landed. It's not ideal, but I do think it's something that we can learn from to do better at in the future. And certainly the community spaces that, again, weave through the neighborhood, those are open, everybody will be using those. And so we're hoping that programming will help to make this feel really like a whole neighborhood. And that leads into our last goal, which is the community and social spaces. We know, again, those are really critical to a vital neighborhood. And so as we're thinking about how we integrate these green spaces throughout the neighborhood, keeping them pedestrian focused, but also sort of doing this double duty of stormwater and edible landscape and gathering and play spaces. And I think they also provide this nice sort of gradation of privacy. So you have a sort of semi-private front porch where you can be sitting and you can wave to your neighbors. You can sort of talk to people close up, but then we have these sort of more semi-public gathering spaces in the greens between the homes. And then eventually we lead to the front corner of the neighborhood where we have these real public spaces, what we're calling the farmstead commons. And here is where we're hoping for large community events, weekly farmers markets. This is the farmhouse building that will house the farm stop that sells the regional produce. And then actually here's maybe a better rendering of what that might start to look like. But we also found a really cool reuse opportunity. There is a pre-Civil War barn in southeastern Michigan that was looking for a new home, if you can believe it. So we are going to deconstruct that barn on site and then reconstruct it on the Veridian site. And it will be a net zero community gathering space to host events sort of year round. And we will load it with solar panels and it'll be a net zero barn. We're really excited about. Okay, so great, we can do this in the Midwest, but how do we do this here? How do we bring some of this to Rhode Island? I think that there are some inherent challenges to doing this sort of super sustainable neighborhood development here, but we also have some opportunities. So I want to end in a more hopeful way. So maybe we'll start with the challenges. I think we do know what to do, but we aren't always making it easy for ourselves to do that. One of the biggest things standing in our way is just the inertia of the status quo. There's risk aversion by big institutions, banks and developers who are used to doing things a certain way, providing a certain number of parking spaces per unit or providing certain financing models. And so it's difficult for these new, smaller entities to get a foot in the door. The investment model for a neighborhood like this can be a challenge. The investment model at Veridian is really complex. And it involves crowdfunding and private investment from a couple of places, public grants, and then the low-income housing tax credits for the affordable housing, all of which is to say there are a couple of people working full-time to just sort of keep this patchwork of investment going. And it shouldn't be that hard. I think there are ways that we can do that more efficiently. Zoning can also be a challenge. There is lots of zoning in the United States and in Rhode Island that prevents this level of density, or they set minimum lot standards that don't allow these kind of mix of uses and this level of compact development. And there are zoning processes that just don't, I think, incentivize or adequately reward innovative development that has these values and really wants to deliver on them. The regulatory environment is also a challenge, and by this, I think really what we mean is around utilities. It's very difficult to do a sort of large community solar installation in a lot of places. There are restrictions on how much sort of community generated power can be put back into the grid. And I think in some cases, the utilities aren't ready to interact at this scale. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to make that more inviting and more sort of easy for developers to do this, but we have to go up the regulatory chain a little bit. And then it's also worth acknowledging costs. There are often higher costs for sustainable materials or materials that have really transparent sort of supply chains and healthy ingredients and are durable. That's not always the case. It's not always more expensive to build sustainably, but and the market has done a lot in the past, let's say 10, 15 years. But I think there's an economy of scale. So if you're doing a big neighborhood, sort of like Veridian, there's an economy of scale to those costs that you can sort of absorb. But this is still hard to do, particularly for smaller projects. And again, something that I think we can work on. But it's not all doom and gloom, especially in Rhode Island. I think we have a couple of unique opportunities here, and one is land. Not that we have a whole lot of vacant land, but just that as a small state, we have lots of land that's proximal to good amenities. So there is precedent and there is opportunity for compact development that's not very far, that can reduce your vehicle miles and really encourage walkable places. We certainly have demand. I think there's some really good and really clear data that we need more housing in Rhode Island. We need more affordable housing, and people here are really interested in sustainable compact development. I think one thing that, as New Englanders, we're familiar with some of these sustainable forms in a way that other parts of the country aren't. We have the triple decker here, so people understand what that is. We're very familiar with historic retrofits. That's another sort of tool in our toolbox of sustainable construction techniques. So selling people on those ideas here in New England is easier than it is in some other parts of the country where those are less familiar. I think we have visionary people here in Rhode Island. I know we do. I mean, I think there is a lot of ambition and talent in Rhode Island from the youth that several of us mentor high schoolers in Providence, and I think they see a lot of potential for the state and a lot of excitement around sort of sustainability. But also in some of the seasoned professionals. We have a terrific network of nonprofit developers and lots of people here who are willing to think outside the box. And I think we also have an engaged public. This certainly could always be better. And my hope is that we can continue to demand more of our sort of leadership and the people who make the rules and the people who are willing to break the rules to do things that are sort of radically sustainable and really usher in this future that we want and need. All this to say, we know what we should be doing vis-a-vis sustainable development, and we know that it's hard. There's a lot of challenges, but hopefully projects like Veridian are showing that it's not impossible. And my sincerest hope is that in a decade or two, this idea of just and ecological development really won't seem so radical. So that's it. I think we have hopefully some time for questions and heckling.
That was awesome, Ben. It seems like it's been months since Jeff brought this up and we started talking about it. I think it has been a couple months.
Yeah.
Super inspirational. And I loved this even more than our planning sessions, and I loved those. So if anyone wants to unmute yourselves, I had a question. So since I have the mic right there, how was the local utility company to work with? Like, how were they? Were they receptive? Were they?
I think it took a little while to warm up to us, but now that they're on board and excited about it, they've put together sort of a team of people on their end to help get that microgrid off the ground. And there's still challenges, particularly in funding something like that, but they're excited about it. And there are a couple of other neighborhoods in Ann Arbor that are being developed that are now sort of following in Veridian's footsteps and looking at microgrids with the utility. And because they've sort of gone through this process already, it's a lot easier for them to replicate it.
So the president of our board, I'm going to call you out, Mitch, is here because he's going to moderate the next session. Mitch, I don't know if you've been following the chat or if he might not be here. He might just be ready for 12:45. So, but do you have it?
I'm here.
Yeah. So what do you think of this conversation? And like, I remember reading Jeremy Rifkin's Fourth Industrial Revolution and saying, oh my gosh, like microgrids, this is happening in other places in the world. Like Mitch is very active in the clean energy space and on boards and has founded a lot of really great organizations in the space. So is it happening where are microgrids in our little world in New England happening?
They are happening where you have campuses, where you have clusters that are owned by the same group. So like a university campus would be a candidate. Housing developments could be a candidate. And the technology are getting cheaper and it's becoming much more economical. But I think that, the stuff that Ben has talked about takes even more broader thinking than just a microgrid. This is a rethinking and it has to occur. It will occur. I just hope it happens fast enough to provide these just fantastic living environments for people. And that's, I think, the key. We need to reduce our carbon footprint, but we also have to enhance the places that we live and the communities that we live in at the same time.
Yeah, so the way my brain thinks, right? This is just, picture a giant whiteboard. So, and that Thinking Fast and Slow, one of my favorite books, and you brought that up. You're constantly kind of in the micro and macro, right, Ben, as you're working on this project. So what does the macro look like and how do we drill it down into the micro measures and goals and KPIs, Mitch? You know what I mean? Like, how do we take what already exists? Like, so this is
one of the things, Ben, that you need is space, right? And you need the owners of the space and you need the government officials and the regulators. So it's a much broader conversation in terms of bringing the different parts of the ecosystem together to see the benefits of this. And then you start with experiments. You start with one spot in Rhode Island that you build this. And you probably make some mistakes initially, but you learn from them. And the second one is going to be better. And then it starts to spread as people say, I want to live in that.
Well, it reminds Amy, what is the project that Kite Architects is working on for homeless? Do you remember the name of that? I don't know if Amy's on right now.
It's the Kintsugi Place project. And I can drop the link to that that conversation in the chat, but yeah.
Yeah, very exciting. Is it Maya, or I don't want to pronounce your name wrong. Do you want to?
Maya is correct. Thanks.
Do you want to ask, you've been awesome posting in here. Or do you live in Rhode Island?
I do. I live in Providence.
So yeah, share some of your questions and observations if you don't mind.
Not at all. My Zoom just crashed, so my previous questions you'll have to help me with. But the one that I just posted was how well is the Veridian vision and others like it being framed within the infrastructure conversation and the potential for significant funding for municipalities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think some of these initiatives around sort of connecting these neighborhoods to the larger region, I think that's where some of that funding may be best positioned, because you know, a neighborhood is great, but it really needs to be connected. And so some of the infrastructure projects in terms of better public transit, better sort of streets and roads for bicyclists. For example, this neighborhood will have great bicycle infrastructure within it, but once you leave the bounds, it's like sort of patchy between there and the university. But with some of this infrastructure funding, we could put, you know, Ann Arbor could put in place a better bike network such that somebody could conceivably bike between this neighborhood and downtown.
And I love the electric car sharing.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. Rebecca, we were just on a meeting yesterday with the general manager of CIC Providence, Rebecca Weber, and she mentioned that she's trying to figure out, like, how can we connect the Innovation and Design District, I'm in it right now, to like the Olneyville neighborhood better. You know, how can we make transportation better? It's like, keep thinking of the Jetsons and, you know, how can we beam ourselves over there? Oh, Will said the military provides a ton of funding for microgrids. Military is always ahead. I don't know if you all know that. Each forward operating base is its own microgrid. Yes, when I went down the rabbit hole, Will, I studied a lot about the military doing that.
Yeah,
I had a question that I didn't. Oh, sorry, Will.
I was just going to say that was a lot of my research in grad school was actually military microgrids, and we looked at ships, and we also looked at forward operating bases because they pay about $110 a gallon for fuel for their generators, and they also consume a lot of power. So even their bases are sometimes organized as microgrids to essentially just lower their monthly energy bills. But that's kind of driving a lot of the algorithms for demand response and everything forward. And then hopefully that technology can be, you know, the swords into plowshares style thing, bring it over into, you know, a residential neighborhood. I was doing projects in an elementary school and then a military forward operating base that was representing like something in Afghanistan at the same time, and the same technology. It was pretty interesting.
So if any of you, I know we have to close up this session, so I'll let Amy take the mic back over, and she has a question. But Will, can you drop your email in here? Will, for those of you who don't know, works on the Commerce RI team representing blue-green economy. So if you have any questions for Will, I think Maya, he's someone that we could pull into that conversation.
Definitely. So I just have a question that's much more general about these kinds of big neighborhood building projects. Is it normal to have this like national scope of team where you have Thrive come in, and is that a common practice?
I would say not. More, I think in our experience, it's a lot more regional. Like many of the big housing projects that we work on in New England are sort of largely composed of teams from New England. But one thing about the Veridian project is they had a much larger team than typical. So they actually had we have a terrific civil engineer from Ann Arbor and an outstanding landscape architect from Ann Arbor. But then we brought in these stormwater engineers from Portland, Oregon, who are really experts at this kind of compact stormwater treatment. And they found us through some of our other neighborhood work. So and now I will say, now that we are sort of moving into this hybrid digital working environment, I think people have a lot easier time wrapping their head around a team that's really remote. So